What I'd like to do now, and it gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce a young man that I met on the mainland at a conference. He is the Director of Tax and Fiscal Policy Task Force at Alec, the American Legislative Exchange Council. Alec is a friend of the taxpayers. Alec is a friend of those people that want responsible government. And Jonathan, as the director of this task force, he works with state legislators and the private sector to develop market policy solutions to state problems. And believe me, there are problems in almost all the other states. Before he joined Alec, Jonathan served as staff economist at the Nonpartisan Tax Foundation, and he authored numerous tax policy studies. He's also best known for the co-author of Rich States, Poor States, which he'll talk about today, and also the Alec Annual Privatization Report. He's a friend to business, he's a friend to the legislature, he's a friend to our community. Please welcome Jonathan Williams.
And thank you, Senator Slom, for that very warm introduction. I guess it proves that not all forms of inflation are harmful. So thank you very much, Senator Slom. And yes, I'm a geeky tax economist and appreciate a very dry sense of humor. Now, you know the difference between an introverted tax economist and an extroverted tax economist, don't you? The introverted tax economist looks at his feet when he talks to you. The extroverted tax economist looks at your feet when he talks to you. And that is the world we operate in tax economist world. And thank you so much for Representative Ward for inviting me here to the Budget Summit today. Representative Ward is our ALEC chairman for the state of Hawaii, and thank you for all the good work that you do, Representative Ward, here in the state of Hawaii. And I'd like to just say greetings from the land of make-believe, Washington, D.C., where I came from yesterday, and I'm very excited to be here in your beautiful state. It's my first time here to the state, and I believe it marks my 47th state I've been to, and you're certainly up there with the most beautiful, and I haven't even got to explore it yet, and so I'm looking forward to that. And excited to hear talk about some of the very pressing issues that you're facing today on the budget and on taxes and the fiscal side of things. And just a word about ALEC. We're the nation's largest nonpartisan organization, individual membership organization of state legislators. And so along with Representative Ward and others, we have about 2,000 state legislators from all 50 states that we work with. And we operate under the assumption of Chief Justice Louis Brandeis that states ought to be laboratories of democracy, that we can take good ideas, pro-taxpayer ideas from the other state, what works, what doesn't work from the other states, and take them into your state to produce better policy results for your taxpayers, the taxpayers of Hawaii. One of the key resources that we work on annually is the book that was mentioned, Rich States, Poor States, which I write with Arthur Laffer, who is Ronald Reagan's economist and founder of the famous Laffer curve, for those of you who remember Economics 101, and our friend Steve Moore at the Wall Street Journal. And in that book, we basically take the laboratories of democracy concept and see, you know, what are the factors driving growth in the states today? What are the states that are getting things right doing, and what can we learn from it? And on the other hand, like my home state of Michigan, what are states doing wrong that we should avoid repeating the mistakes that have been so costly? And it's a very personal issue for me, economic development and budgeting. It's really two sides of the same fiscal coin, because my hometown, Saginaw, Michigan, anyone familiar with Saginaw, Michigan? A few people here. Simon and Garfunkel, if you're a fan, they sang a song about Saginaw, Michigan. But you know, it's a town of that is a General Motors town. In 1960, there was about 120,000 people that lived in my hometown. The new census count came out, obviously, in December. Today, the population is about 50,000. That's the type of economic vitality and jobs that we've lost in the private sector because of too much taxes, too much regulation, and just a poor approach to policy over the years. And so Rich States, Poor States is hopefully our contribution that other states and localities can avoid the fate of my home state and my home city. One of the interesting things that we're tracking today is obviously everyone's facing a budget shortfall. You're not alone facing your shortfall here in Hawaii. In fact, we expect roughly 45 out of the 50 states to be facing a shortfall for their next fiscal year starting July 1st for most states. And it's really something that, it's kind of like daytime TV. I like to compare it to. Pretty much anything you do to it's going to make it better. We've seen a lot of the revenue just dry up. We've seen now stimulus funds from Washington, D.C. running out going forward. That's going to create a little bit of a problem. Also, with the stimulus funds that came, you had the maintenance of effort requirements that were attached to those dollars that will last far longer than those dollars will. And that was one of the reasons we kind of warned state legislators to be very careful what you ask for from Washington, because we all know a dollar has never gone from Washington, D.C. without about 10,000 strings attached to it. And now we're starting to find that out in the states a little bit the hard way. And, as the famous philosopher and baseball great Yogi Berra would say, this is like deja vu all over again, because, we forget there's this thing called the business cycle. And we have a boom economy, we have a bust economy, we have a cycle. The problem is that so many times during the good years, state governments spent all the surplus dollars. Sometimes revenue grew double digits every year for several years. They spent everything, didn't put it in a rainy day fund, and now all of a sudden we have a budget shortfall because of spending growth. In fact, we find that over the last decade, state and local governments have grown faster than the private sector by 90% over the last decade alone. And it's very clear that we don't have a shortage of tax revenue in the states. We have a spending problem, and it's been a very acute problem for the last decade. And now we're starting to realize that as we, obviously you have to deal with the balanced budget. 49 out of the 50 states have balanced budget requirements. We don't have one in Washington, obviously, the way we budget. The other thing is, you can't print money like we do in Washington. And so obviously you have a very tough task ahead of you. But I think it's very important what the representatives here have put together on the budget proposals. And I'll get into those in a little bit more detail here in a second. One of the other major factors we see facing the states today is shortfalls, the unfunded liabilities in public pension systems and retiree health care that states are on the hook for. We think the estimate of probably the 50 states is about $3 trillion in unfunded liabilities just on the public pension side. And, in Hawaii, there's been several estimates of what the state will owe on the unfunded liabilities and pensions. One was done recently by the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., which I think is probably the most accurate. That shows that Hawaii's unfunded liabilities and public pensions are $18.5 billion over the next 30 years, is what we've promised, but we don't have the money to pay for yet. And some other estimates, some people try to sugarcoat pension problems and say we really don't have any crisis going on. That would rely on a couple of very flawed assumptions that are fairly prevalent out there, unfortunately. People that say there's no pension shortfall believe that we'll make up whatever we owe today in future market booms. The problem is that many states still have 7 to 8 to 9% rate of return assumption in their pension funds that we're going to make up these losses over the next 30 years. Anybody here over the last 10 years average a rate of return of 7, 8, or 9%? If anybody did, I'd like to ask some financial advice from you after the meeting here, because it just hasn't happened. The overall market return has been minuscule over the last decade. It's put states further behind. The other issue is states don't follow the thing that we do in the private sector called generally accepted accounting principles. In the government sector, you follow GASB, Government Accounting Standards Board, which allows you to do some very creative things that the private sector only wishes they could do, but if they actually did, they'd probably be in prison today. And that is, if you have losses, you're allowed under GASB standards for governments to smooth out those losses. So 2008, many of the states lost 25 to 30% of their total asset base in their pension funds, but they're allowed to smooth out those asset losses over 5 to 8 years, so we don't really see them show up even fully today from 2008 yet. These pension problems are going to be a huge issue. This is not a Republican versus Democrat, liberal versus conservative problem. This is a financial sustainability problem for the states out there. And if we don't tackle that financial cost driver, the states are not going to recover for a very, very long time. In fact, the GAO in Washington said, this is a coming reset in state government, that states and localities will not recover to their pre-recession position for 60 years unless they get these financial cost drivers under control. And so I encourage you to think big when it comes to reforms on the pension side. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit on the budget specifics from our Budget Reform Toolkit publication that we just released late last year. We mailed a compliment. Our economy, much like today, is too fragile to raise taxes, so we have to live within our means. And what they did was, first, let's define our core government principles. What are the things that government exists to do? And let's make sure that we do those things. What are in the state constitution? What are the things that our taxpayers demand? And then they ask some very important questions. What is the role of government? What are the essential services that government must provide to fulfill its purpose? How will we know if government is doing a good job? What should all of this cost? And then when cuts are made, how will they be properly prioritized? And they found that prior to this process in Washington State, agencies didn't even have to create mission statements to why they existed and what success would look like you would have in a private sector to determine what the priorities of that agency would be. So they instituted that. They made agency directors come in and prioritize their levels of services in that agency. And we find, unfortunately, today, only about 50 states actually require agency mission statements, which is fascinating that practice hasn't been more of a consensus to go forward. And so Washington State got together, and in the Budget Reform Toolkit, we show exactly what they cut, what they thought were the lowest priorities of the budget, and what they continued to fund. And they solved their nearly $3 billion shortfall without a dime in tax increases on a bipartisan basis. And so instead of taking a machete to state government necessarily and saying, we're just going to slash and burn, let's take very much a more a scalpel to the situation and say, what are the priority areas of government? Let's fund those things. What are the areas that are not functioning well? What are some things that we need to do differently? And let's take a smarter look at budget reform. And that's what we outlined here, and I know that's what the caucus is working on. A couple of things here that I think are also important points to note on model legislation that we've developed that could be quite helpful on various concepts. One is, require a nonpartisan revenue forecast, independent certification of the budget to make sure that games aren't being played with the revenue numbers that are coming out. That's an important piece that we wanted to see other states adopt. Another one is in the tools to improve budget transparency, which I think is very key to the process. And that, we need to have a transparent budget website where taxpayers know where their dollars are going. It shouldn't take a PhD from Harvard to figure out where your hard-earned tax dollars are going. And so to put up your state budget website like you've done is a very good service to the taxpayers of Hawaii here. But increasing that visibility, I think, is key. We've seen now about 45 states across the country have followed our model legislation to develop a transparent budget website, either through executive order from a governor's office or from legislation. And so that's been something that should be a no-brainer for the states out there today because, taxpayers deserve that knowledge. The other one in our budget transparency section is adopt a 72-hour budget timeout so that your representatives actually have time to know what they're going to be voting on before they have to cast those votes, so that the staff have time to analyze it, and that as you, as taxpayers out there, have the ability to analyze what your elected representatives are going to be voting on. That ought to be just standard good government procedure out there today, but so many times things get pushed through where the ink is still drying on the page, and you have to be voting on very important matters that will affect the future of your taxpayers and the economy here. And then also, Hawaii is one of very few states that does not have a fiscal note process. That's something that's a very generally accepted good government practice, not a partisan issue, very much just good government issue. Let's have some fiscal notes to see what the revenue impact, but also maybe what the impact will be to the business community, to the private sector, to have a small business impact statement as well as a revenue fiscal note. That's a very much a basic that should be done to change the budget process. Now, as I talked about some of the major cost drivers being pensions and health care for retired state and local workers, what are a few options that we're seeing out there? On the pension side, we're seeing many states will be asking for state and local workers to contribute more towards their pensions if they're going to keep their defined benefit system. You'd be surprised that many states, state and local workers don't contribute a dime towards their defined benefit pension, where in the private sector, there's no such thing as defined benefit pensions anymore. I mean, 90% of the private sector has moved to 401k plans a decade or two ago, and we're seeing now state governments explore that option. In the late 90s, my home state of Michigan, under Governor Engler, actually did this and moved all new state employees into 401k plans. Last year, we saw Utah take that approach and create a defined contribution system where they actually contribute 10% of the salary of that employee and put it into a defined contribution fund that they can manage to a limited range of opportunities to invest. And the public employee unions in Utah actually said this is a good idea. We're going to support it because we have a financially unsustainable pension liability that we're not going to be able to get out of under the current defined benefit system. On the health care side, the option from Mitch Daniels in Indiana, what he's done is give state employees the option of sticking with their insurance through the state or giving them a health savings account. And what we saw, the results have been fascinating when people are given the choice in Indiana. 70% of Indiana's 30,000 state workers have voluntarily chosen the health savings account option and has reduced the current expenditures on health care for Indiana extremely well, but also, most importantly, it's eliminated those unfunded liabilities going forward off the books of Indiana, which, by the way, S&P and the other bond rating agencies are taking a pretty close look now at some of those unfunded liabilities. They look at your bond rating. And so those are some key reforms that we have. Also, we have some ideas on basically applying the Yellow Pages test to state government. That is, if something is done in the private sector, why is the government competing with the private sector? Most likely the private sector is going to bring you that service at a lower cost and a higher quality anyways. And so looking at some areas for outsourcing and privatization. I would just add this last note is do not expect another bailout from Washington, D.C., whether it's your current state budget or your pension obligations. We have obviously over a $14 trillion national debt. Let me just tell you a story that my friend George Will talks about occasionally, and how fast government debt has grown in relation to the private sector, and this is what Marco Rubio is getting at. In the World War I era, the richest man in America was J.D. Rockefeller. He could have cut a personal check and retired the entire national debt with his personal check. Today, the richest man in America, Bill Gates Jr., if he wrote a personal check of his entire net worth, it wouldn't cover 3 months of the interest on our national debt today. That is how quickly our national debt has grown in relation to the private sector. Our country at the national level cannot afford to bail out the states, however much of a short-term problem you guys have. That's why you need to look at the budget solutions proposed here by Representative Ward and his colleagues. And we hope that Alec can be a resource with our budget reform toolkit. We hope that you call on us, you visit our website, alec.org. And I think this fight is certainly just starting. As Winston Churchill would famously say, this is not the end, nor the beginning of the end.
Representative Kimberly Pine.
With a vision from Senator Marco Rubio, who I believe is going to be one of our great leaders of this next generation. As he stated, our generation's greatest challenge is an economy that isn't growing alongside a national debt that is. As a born and raised local girl, the debate has always been that government should always do more here in the state of Hawaii. Well, this economy has proved that we just can't do that anymore. And it has proved that a government that does everything is a government that we cannot afford. And our recent almost shutdown of our federal government has also proved that the federal government certainly should not be relied on. And so those of us who spoke today, we're asking you to accept a new vision. Perhaps focusing on what we've always focused on and the vision of government always doing more. Perhaps the new vision should be about creating a government that should do well, only what it should. All of us have made very difficult decisions, both the Democrats and the Republicans in both the House and the Senate, And we are certainly in a very uncomfortable place that we have never been to before. And as you can see, the Senate Democrats certainly disagree with the House Democrats. And certainly today you have seen that the House Republicans disagree with the entire Senate minority. But what we have done differently here for you today is we've made the process open. Because we believe that some of the ideas are the greatest ideas, and they come from both parties, and some are very controversial, and some are not very easy to swallow. But we know that by opening the process and keeping the debate intellectual, that we know that we will find the true solution for Hawaii. And we want you, the public, to be a part of it. And today, we hope, is the first day of that. Mahalo so much for joining us. We look forward to a very good year because you are now involved. Mahalo.
But what's your homework? Where do we go from here? You go on www.Hawaii State Budget Online, and there's a section that says, send us your budget, because you can send it to us, you can send it to Speaker Say, you can send it to anybody in this building with your selections. We gave you a head start. We gave you those things on revenue, those things on expenses that comes out in balance. But as Kimberly just said, you guys are smart. You're from Hawaii. Follow the money. Thank you for following us today. Thank you, and aloha for your